American English, American English webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Welcome everyone to the first webinar in American English Webinar Series 7, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. Let's begin this series with a look at this great photo that shows teachers in the Sarmila Pudel viewing group from Pokhara, Nepal, participating in a webinar during Series 6. We love to see teachers learning during the webinars and exchanging ideas. So please share your webinar viewing photos by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. We may feature them in the next webinar. And thank you to everyone who sent in photos during Series 6. I'm Lauren Whitaker, part of the American English Webinar team, also known as Moderator Lauren, and you'll see Moderator Heather in the chat box here to help you during the webinar. We'll be here to assist you as you participate during the webinar series. Here you can see the Series 7 schedule. We have great topics lined up for you on grammar, media literacy, and teaching business English. Our next session in 2 weeks on September 20th will be on ideas for subtle correction during speaking tasks with Elizabeth Hepford. Our webinars are each 60 minutes long. Webinars are often related to a theme found on the American English website. The Teacher's Corner section from the website shown here features resources and lesson ideas related to the month's topic. The theme for September is Teaching Beginners. The way for you to participate is by typing in the chat box, as many of you are already doing. The chat box is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over, the NEEN Community for Teachers, which we'll look at in more detail momentarily. The presenter will also ask you poll questions. These multiple choice and multiple answer questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. Unfortunately, some people may experience technical problems during the webinar. We will let you know if we are having a global problem. If you do lose sound, you can follow along with the caption pod at the bottom of the screen if refreshing your internet browser doesn't correct the problem. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars. During the series, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Office or local U.S. Embassy after the series ends. To ensure you are eligible for the certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, you will click on the internet link we provide so that you can submit the requested attendance information. We hope many of you are already NEEN community members, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join us. It may take up to 72 hours for your NEEN registration to be approved, especially at the beginning of a new series. Here, you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings and featured materials. The NEEN is also where you can ask presenter questions after the webinar and live chat with your fellow community members. And before I introduce our webinar for today, I'd also like to announce that American English is launching its first MOOC, Massive Open Online Course, for English language teachers. It begins on September 25th, and for more information and to register for free, visit www.aeteacher.org/MOOC. Check out the Teacher's Corner on the American English website, too. And now for today's webinar, Connecting Reading and Writing in Grammar Teaching, a Functional Approach. Today, in this webinar, we will explore teaching grammar from a meaning-based perspective, feature key components of a functional approach to grammar teaching, analyze how words and sentences produce meaning, and introduce practical activities for connecting reading and writing to grammar teaching. It is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Lottie Baker. Lottie Baker is an assistant professor of curriculum and pedagogy at the George Washington University, where she directs graduate programs in English language teacher education. She has been a U.S. Department of State English Language Fellow and English Language Specialist in Southeast Asia. Lottie has taught ESL in the United States at the primary, secondary, and community college levels. She also holds a master's degree in education with a specialization in ESL and a doctorate in curriculum and instruction. Welcome, Lottie.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Lauren. Welcome and thanks for joining us. It's great to be here to talk about grammar. It's such an important topic. As Lauren mentioned, this webinar is titled Connecting Reading and Writing and Grammar Teaching, a Functional Approach. Let's see what some of your ideas are about teaching grammar. In the lobby before the webinar, some of you responded to a few polls. You indicated how much you agreed or disagreed with a few statements about grammar teaching. The first statement was, it's important to learn all of the grammar rules before reading and writing long text. It looks like the results are mixed. About half of you agreed with this statement and half of you disagreed with this statement. The second statement was grammar teaching means correcting students' errors. Here it looks like the majority of you disagreed. About 60% of you disagreed with this statement and 35 or 40% of you agreed. And then last, grammar is not that important in the communicative language teaching, CLT. And it looks like most of you disagreed with this statement. So 75% of you disagreed with this statement, and you think that grammar teaching is important in communicative language teaching. And that's good to hear because grammar does play a role in communicative classrooms. There are different ways to think about each of these statements, and there's no one right answer. These are just good statements to think about. After the webinar, I encourage you to return to these statements and see if your opinions have changed any. Let's get warmed up with a quick chat about grammar. We'll do a little free association thinking. So you can type your response in the chat box. First, what do you think about when you hear the word grammar? Don't think too hard about this, but just write what you think of in the chat box. So let's see. I see rules, challenge, difficult, boring, writing, difficult, a set of rules, accuracy, tenses, boredom, structure. Okay. Parts of the language, parts of speech, memorizing. Okay, now let's change it up and think about, what do you think your students think about when they hear the word grammar? Some similar ideas, right? Necessary, boring. I see boring a lot here. Difficult, boring. Yes, stressful, boring. So these are some negative words here that we think of when we hear the word grammar. A functional approach in grammar, which we'll talk about in a minute, can often shift or change these negative perceptions and help us see grammar as important to communication. So this brings us to the goals for today. So just like in our teaching with students, starting with goals is a good way to focus on the topic and get the most of our time together. So for the next few minutes or so, we will understand grammar from a functional perspective. We'll identify 3 functions of grammar. And by functions, I mean tasks or jobs that grammar does. And third, we will explore classroom applications of functional grammar. Before we go further, I always think it's important to understand new teaching methods in the context of other approaches that we use. A lot of effective methods are only effective because they build on things we are already doing. So for grammar teaching, one traditional method is called grammar translation. Let's try the hand-raising tool. Can you raise your hand if you have heard of this method? Oh, I'm seeing lots of hands. Oh yes, many of you have heard of the grammar translation method. Great. Great. And this also shows me that you know how to use the hand-raising tool. Nice job. You can lower your hands now. Okay. Grammar translation methods focus on the translation of written documents. So the focus is not placed on communication. A lot of grammar learning was memorizing rules in order to translate. So while this approach is not bad, we can add some different methods to help students apply grammar and communication. Now we are shifting or transitioning in how we use language. More and more of us teach language to communicate with people. Can you raise your hand if you use the communicative approach, or we can say communicative language teaching? You might see CLT sometimes for communicative language teaching. Oh, I see many hands. Oh, that makes me so happy. Yes, wonderful. Wonderful, yes. Excellent. So you can lower your hands now. The communicative method shifts from focusing on knowing about language to actually using language to communicate. The functional approach to grammar is a way to teach grammar and teach about language while still communicating and using language to communicate. In one of the pre-reading articles by Karen Adams, she gave some good ideas about using grammar in communicative settings. She talked about ways students use grammar structures to talk about their lives or things that they've done, for instance. And then you also read about language awareness in the other pre-reading article. And this is another good example of how to communicate grammar in the communicative classroom. In language awareness, students notice different grammar structures in the English that they hear or that they read. And some of the activities we'll talk about today are similar, where students notice how grammar is used to make meaning. So what is a functional approach to grammar? A functional approach focuses on what grammar does and why we use grammar, rather than just how to make certain forms and structures. When we think about what grammar does, the jobs or the functions of grammar, we can say that grammar does 3 main tasks. These are makes meaning or expresses ideas, connects ideas, and creates relationships or creates social relationships. And these are relationships between the reader and the writer, or the listener and the speaker. So grammar does all 3 of these things together. So why is using a functional approach important in English teaching? Here are some reasons why it might be a good idea to try this approach. First, it connects grammar to meaningful concepts, and we know that meaningful learning sticks in our students' minds more so than rote learning or memorization. Second, it fosters critical thinking. So I believe American English recently had a series of webinars on the importance of these higher thinking skills. Third, a functional approach can integrate all 4 language skills. So reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So we can talk about the grammar that we read and write, and we can also analyze the grammar that we use in speaking. Fourth, a functional approach promotes discussion, and this goes along with using speaking and listening because we have students talking about language. And lastly, it's a great way for us as instructors to understand language at a deep level. And this is true for both native speakers like myself who might use grammar, English grammar unconsciously, so to speak, and sometimes have a difficult time explaining it to learners, but it's also true for some of us who have learned English via traditional methods and can answer how to form certain sentences or structures, but not necessarily why. So, remember, I said grammar does 3 big acts or tasks simultaneously or at the same time. First, grammar makes meaning or expresses idea. Second, grammar connects ideas or links ideas together. And third, grammar creates relationships. What I'm going to do is explain to you a little bit about each of these 3 functions and then describe some ways you might integrate this into the classroom. First, let's talk about how grammar makes meaning. By make meaning, I mean express ideas or thoughts. This might seem like the most obvious task. We use language to tell about our thoughts. But how exactly does language make meaning? When we think of the functional approach, we can say that language makes meaning through big chunks, meaningful chunks of language. I'm going to share with you a few terms that we use for these chunks. First, language makes meaning through participants, and participants are the who or the what is performing an action in a sentence. Participants are often nouns or noun groups. Second, processes. And processes are the what are the thinking, the doing, the feeling, or the being actions. And these are often verbs. And third, circumstances. When, where, how are the processes occurring? And this is often seen in prepositional phrases. So you might ask, how is this different than how we normally think of parts of speech, like nouns and verbs and prepositional phrases? I will show you an example. Here's a sentence that I wrote about my favorite activity. This is something we sometimes have students write about, their favorite activities. So I write, my favorite activity is hiking in the mountains. And if I were to analyze this sentence using a more traditional analysis with parts of speech, it might look something like this, where I identify the adjective, the noun, the verb, the prepositions. This, for some students, might seem like a lot and kind of messy. Let me show you how it would look from a functional perspective using the 3 terms I mentioned. Here, I have the whole phrase, my favorite activity, as one participant. Then the process is, and then another participant is hiking, and then in the mountains goes together as a circumstance. So this is not necessarily contradicting our traditional parts of speech analysis, but it's a way of looking at parts of sentences and looking at them in meaningful chunks. Let's have you try to identify the parts of a sentence using these 3 big terms, these 3 big chunks. So here's a sentence. We're at the polls. Thank you, Lauren. Many students like to play games in English class. So which phrase indicates participants? Many students like to play in English class, or none of the above? Oh, excellent. Excellent, excellent. Looks like everyone chose correctly. Almost everyone chose correctly. A, many students. So together, that works together as those two words as the participant. Let's look at the process. Can we go to there we go. Which phrase indicates the process? So many students like to play games in English class. Many students like to play in English class, none of the above. Yes, like to play. Excellent. And again, we're taking chunks of language rather than breaking it word by word. And then lastly, what about the circumstance? Which phrase indicates the circumstance? Many students like to play games in English class. Yes. Yes, it looks like most of you have it. C, the letter C, in English class, goes together as the circumstance. In this case, the circumstance describes where the students like to play English games. Great, thank you, Lauren. We can go back to the presentation now. All right, thank you. So we can have students do the same thing and identify these meaningful chunks too. And then we can connect these chunks to how they make meaning in the sentence. This can be called a close reading analysis. To do this, as a teacher, you will first select a short passage. And it's a good idea to select a passage or a text on a topic that is familiar to students or that students have some background knowledge about. You might use pictures or visual supports if it's something new so that they understand the topic. Second, help students identify the three parts we talked about: participants, processes, and circumstances. This will take some practice, so you will want to model this many times first. And third, focus on each part and ask questions about the meaning. For instance, you can ask, why did the author choose to use this language? Or how does it contribute to the meaning of the text? This sounds really complex, some of the information I am telling you, but some of this you can even do with beginners if you use small pieces of language or short sentences to help students recognize the participants, the processes, and the circumstances. One activity that you can do to really help students understand the meaning of the text and help students recognize how words contribute to the meaning is that we can have students change sentences. So to do this, first, the teacher will rewrite the text with blanks. So again, you select a sentence that you think students understand already, and then rewrite that sentence with blanks. I'll show you an example in a minute. Then you have students fill in the blanks with different participants or different words depending on the blank. Third, you discuss how the different words change the meaning of the text. Change the meaning of the text. Now let me show you an example. So here is a sentence. This sentence says, the young baseball players from Venezuela are playing at the Little League World Series. This is a sentence that comes from a news story from Voice of America's Learning English. Some of you may have used this before. I noticed in the Ning we had some discussion about authentic materials, and Voice of America's Learning English is a great place to find authentic materials that are appropriate for different levels. So this sentence is from a longer article about the Little League World Series, which is an organization for baseball players, for young baseball players like this in the picture. So to do this activity with the changing sentences with the blanks, we might change the word young and write a blank instead. The blank baseball players from Venezuela are playing at the Little League World Series. So what could we write instead of young? Try to write in the text box. The chat box. What are some ideas? What are some other words we can replace for this word young that might change the meaning of this sentence? Talented, old, energetic, handsome, hungry, great, old, cute, famous. Yes, and see how this changes the meaning of the sentence. If we say the handsome baseball players from Venezuela are playing at the Little League World Series, we really change the participant here by changing this one term. So this is a way to help students understand the importance of how this participant can change the meaning of the sentence. To extend this idea even further, you can write a sentence with the same structure but on a different topic. Again, you can have students complete the blanks and change the meaning of the sentence. Here's an example. The topic is different. You see, I have the blank teachers from blank are working in the classroom. So you can have students write different words and have different ideas about this sentence. So depending on how you write the participant, you change the meaning of the sentence. Oh, and I see some ideas here already. The committed teachers, the English teachers, the ESL teachers, the beautiful teachers from Bolivia. That's someone from Bolivia. The hardworking teachers, enthusiastic teachers from Mexico. Great, great thoughts. Okay. If you want to make this even more advanced, you can do this kind of activity with a longer passage. I'll show you an example. Can we go to the polls? Thanks, Lauren. So this is a longer passage about a pigeon, which is a kind of bird that you see in this photo. I'm going to read the passage, and then as I'm reading, can you list the participants that you hear in the text box, in the chat box? One familiar urban dweller is the pigeon. Long ago, it was called a rock dove because it lived in the rocky cliffs along the coast of Europe. Today, it flourishes all over the United States in the nooks and crannies of our cities. Oh, I see lots of great ideas here. Rock dove, pigeon, familiar, urban dwellers. Yes, there are many different correct answers. It is an example, right? Because that is a participant. So this is a great way to show students how an author can refer to the same concept, pigeon, using different terms. It's also a great way to focus on vocabulary. So we could look at this term urban dweller together, urban dweller, and think about, well, what does this mean? And break it down for students and say, well, urban means city, and dweller means someone who dwells or someone who lives. So urban dweller means someone who lives in the city. And we can talk about how the author describes the pigeon as living in the city just by using this participant. Let's look at another example. Can you list the processes in this text? What processes do you notice? So remember, these are things that are doing or being. Yes, lots of being processes. And by being, I mean words like is or was, to be words. Yes, was called. Yes, good. Lived, flourishes. That's another vocabulary word that you can talk about with students. Flourishes, meaning there are many of them. It flourishes all over the United States. Great. Okay, and lastly, let's look at the circumstances. Can you list some of the circumstances in this text? What circumstances? So remember, circumstances describe when or where the processes happen. And they're often prepositional phrases. Yes, in the rocky cliffs, long ago, today. Yes, excellent. I like this passage for circumstances because you can show students how the author, if you notice, he uses long ago as one circumstance, and then in the next sentence, he uses today. So he really contrasts those two sentences with long ago and today. And so you can point that out to students. Again, this is a longer passage and it's more advanced, so you might not use this passage or a long passage like this with beginners, but you can start having students from the very beginning analyze pieces of language for participants, processes, and circumstances, even if you look at short sentences. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, so next, we're going to talk about the second function or the second job of grammar. So first, we talked about how grammar makes meaning or expresses ideas. Second, we're going to talk about how grammar connects ideas. So how does language or grammar connect ideas? So when we talked about making meaning, we said that language makes meaning through participants, processes, and circumstances. So when we talk about connecting ideas, we're going to use the term cohesive devices. This sounds like a big term, but the word cohesive means connect or stick together. So cohesive devices help ideas stick together or connect ideas. Here in this table are some examples of cohesive devices. I really like this chart because it shows the terms we use to connect ideas with the meanings of the term. So for example, in the first row, the terms and then, furthermore, all of those terms mean in addition. In the second row, the terms but, instead, however, on the other hand, these are words that we use to contrast or to compare and contrast, and so on. You can return to this chart later on after the webinar to refer if you would like. I think it is a great reference for us and for our students and when we write and read. An activity you can do to help students recognize these cohesive devices is simply have them identify these devices. So this is the way this works. First, the teacher selects a short passage. Again, you want to choose a text that students understand. So something on a topic that's interesting for students and something that they have some background knowledge about. Then you can have students identify the cohesive devices. You might have them use a chart like the one I just showed you to support them and help them get ideas of different cohesive devices. And then lastly, the students can write or document these cohesive devices in a chart and explain their importance. So explain why they what meaning the cohesive devices adds to the sentence. Let me show you an example. Here is a paragraph about learning new languages. As I read it, you can write in the chat box different cohesive devices or different connectors that you see. So, learning a new language is challenging for many adults because they are busy. However, language learning routines can make a big difference. For instance, students can review new vocabulary every night before bed. Another idea is to listen to the news in the language they are learning. Oh, I see lots of great ideas in the chat box. Great. However, for instance, because, however, another, excellent. Another idea, yes. I'll show you what this paragraph looks like with the cohesive devices underlined. And then the next step is you could have students write these cohesive devices in a chart and reflect on what they mean. Think about what each cohesive device means. So I'll show you what I mean. So here, for instance, we have the word because. And this word because shows that it provides a reason that learning a new language is hard. In the next row, we have the word however. And this shows it's a contradiction. So we start talking about how language learning is hard for adults, but then we introduce a new idea that's different. So this really helps students pay attention to these words, and analyze how they are linking or connecting the sentences. Okay, another activity you can do with connecting ideas is called sentence combining. And this activity was in the pre-reading article from the Forum magazine. So some of you may have read this, and some of you may be familiar with this activity. So to do this activity, first you take a text composed of short sentences. This might be a passage from an authentic text, a real-life text. It might be a passage from a textbook, or it could be student writing. And in fact, student writing is often ideal or good for this kind of activity because beginning student writers tend to use shorter sentences. Second, you can group related ideas. So help students look at these short sentences and group the sentences that go together or that are about the same topic. Third, you combine sentences using connectors or cohesive devices. I am using this word connectors and cohesive devices to refer to the same thing. And then students can explain their choice, their rationale for their choice of connectors. So why they chose the word because or why they chose the word and. And when you do this activity, it's often helpful to have a chart like the first one I showed you with the cohesive devices and their meaning. So it gives students an idea of different choices of cohesive devices they can use. And remember, there's no one correct answer. Really, the goal of these activities is discussion about language and heightening students' awareness of language. Let me show you an example. Here are some sentences about my pet. I like to use this example with students because students often write about their pets, at least in my class. So, my pet Chihuahua is cute. He is small. Many Chihuahuas bark a lot. My dog is calm. He does not like strangers. He is still nice to the neighbors. So one way this paragraph might look with connectors or with cohesive devices is my pet Chihuahua is cute and small. Even though many Chihuahuas bark a lot, my dog is calm. However, he does not like strangers. Nevertheless, he is still nice to the neighbors. Yes, and there are many different ways that I could have connected these sentences, and I see in the chat box, I see some different ideas too, which is great. And again, this is why I like having students use that chart as a support, because they can see different ideas of different cohesive devices and try them out. And then they can talk about why they selected certain words. This also helps them when they're reading because they can think about why the author chose certain words to use. Let's let you try combine some sentences. Can we go to the polls, Lauren? Okay, so I'm going to give you some sentences about the morning. And then you see on the bottom of the screen, there's some cohesive devices with the chart to help you think about it. So look at the first two sentences. It says, the morning is the best time of day. It feels cool outside. So if we group those two sentences together, which cohesive device would you use to combine the first two sentences? Because, however, for instance, and. The morning is the best time of day. It feels cool outside. Looks like many of you, almost 80%, selected A, because. Some of you also said and some of you said however. I think there could be more than one right answer here. I think either because or and works well because these sentences go together. The morning is the best time of day and it feels cool outside. You could even use however. The morning is the best time of day, however it feels cool outside. For someone who does not like the cool weather, they might use however. So it really changes the meaning of the sentence. This is how powerful some of these cohesive devices can be. Okay, let's ask another question about these sentences. Which cohesive device, here we go, sorry. Which cohesive device would you use to combine the last two sentences? So the last two sentences say, the streets are not quiet in the evening. Many people are leaving work. So we could choose because, however, for instance, and. Yes, I tend to agree because. It looks like 86% of you chose because A. I think that is a good option here. Although and could work too. The streets are not quiet in the evening and many people are leaving work. Yes. Yeah, so again, I want to emphasize that the goal of this activity isn't necessarily to come up with one right answer, but to talk about language and about how these cohesive devices can change the meaning and can connect together sentences in different ways. Great job. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. Okay, thank you, Lauren. So we've talked about two different functions or tasks of language. We talked about how language or grammar makes meaning, and we also talked about how language connects ideas. The third topic, the third task or job that grammar does is grammar creates relationships. And so when I say create relationships, I mean relationships between the reader and the writer and the listener and the speaker. So even when we're reading books, we are engaging in a relationship with the author. And the kinds of language or the kinds of grammar we use can define the type of relationship. So just as I shared with the other two functions that there are certain tools or certain ways that grammar carries out these functions, so for instance, when I talked about making meaning, I said that grammar uses participants, processes, and circumstances to make meaning. And then when we were talking about connecting ideas, we talked about cohesive devices and how grammar uses cohesive devices to connect ideas. So when we talk about creating relationships, we can talk about modality. And as many of you may know, modality refers to the probability or obligation that things happen. So we can use modality to also create relationships between the listener and the speaker. There are different ways to express modality. Many of you, and I see here in this chat box, great, many of you are familiar with modal verbs. So things like must, could, may, must, could, may, can, should. These are commonly taught, and they're very important. We can also express modality, though, through other words as well. So we can use adverbs. So things like maybe, perhaps, arguably. Or we could use modal nouns, so possibility. We could say, it is a possibility that it will rain. Or requirement. It is a requirement that you do your homework. And so all of these terms express either probability or obligation, and we can use these terms to create relationships or establish relationships between the speaker and the listener. A great place to find examples of modal language is in advice columns. Some of you may have heard of Dear Abby columns in the United States, or in England, they call these agony aunts. Can you raise your hand if you have advice columns in newspapers where you live? I'll show you an example here in a second. Oh, look at all of these hands. Great. Looks like many of you have examples of these in your country where you live. Great. Okay, you can put your hands down. You can lower your hands. Nice. So in these advice columns, readers of the newspaper can write in letters and ask for advice. And then a columnist, someone who writes for the newspaper, will respond and give advice. So here's an example. Someone writes, Dear Abby. And Abby is the name of the person who gives the advice at the newspaper. So she says, Dear Abby, my friend is always tired and sick because she does not eat healthy foods. How can I help her? And then in the bottom, this is Abby's response. She says, I think the best approach would be to talk about this with your friend. Tell her that you are concerned about her health, and you might suggest that she eat more fruits and vegetables. It is essential that you also eat healthy to show support. So this is a great example of some modal language, and you see I've underlined and bolded some examples of modality here, and you see how it's not just the modal verbs, although we do have might suggest, but we have phrases that go together to make modality as well. So one activity we can do with these modal words is called a modality scale. To implement this activity, or to do this activity, what you need to do is first, you can have students underline the terms of modality, like I showed you just now in the passage from the Dear Abby response. Second, students can sort the phrases that they underlined on a continuum, so from gentle or uncertain to more firm and certain. And then third, students discuss their rationales behind their sorting, and they explain why they thought one term was more firm than another term. And this is where there's no one right answer. Again, there's many different answers, but the idea is for students to be thinking about language and thinking about how language makes certain statements more firm or more gentle. This is also a way with this modality that you can see how the reader or the speaker establishes or makes a relationship with the listener by how strong the language she uses. So I'll show you an example using the modality language that we saw in the Dear Abby column. So here you could be your modality scale, and we have at the bottom uncertain or gentle. And then here at the top, we have very certain or firm. And here are some of the terms, the modality terms from the Dear Abby column. So we have, I think the best approach would be, you might suggest that, tell her that, it is essential that. This is my opinion of how these terms would fall on the modality scale. But you could argue different ways, and you might have students have different opinions, and that's okay. The idea is to have them talk about this. One way to do this activity and involve more tactile or touching and movement is to cut out these terms and have students actually manipulate or move these terms on the scale. You could also have students move around the room and assign each student a term or modality term and move around the room in the scale from uncertain to very certain. So these are some activities that might be good to get students moving and engaged with grammar. So let's have you try with this idea of a modality scale. Let's go to the polls. So I know many of you have beginners, and we talked about more making some of these activities appropriate for beginners. So if you're beginning to teach modals, you're just beginning this process, you might just look at the modal verbs. So you could ask the question, which modal belongs on the uncertain or the gentle end of the scale? And you can choose all that apply. So there might be more than one. Could, should, must, or might. All right, I see people are selecting the first one, could, and the last one, might. Yes, I tend to agree. Those two are definitely more uncertain, and the middle two, should and must, are more firm. And so if someone were to tell you that you must do something, it's a sign that that person is in authority or has authority over the topic. Great. Okay, let's look at another poll. So this one, okay, which modal would lie on the very certain or firm end of the scale? So let's flip it around and see. Okay, great. Yes. Yes, I agree. Yes, must, should. Yes, definitely. Definitely, I think must is probably one of the most certain or firm terms. And then let's look at one more. Oops. One more. There we go. Which option belongs on this uncertain or gentle end of the poll? So this one might be one that's more advanced for students because we're using larger bits of language. So you could say, you might want to leave early to catch the train. You must leave early to catch the train. It's advisable to leave early to catch the train. So which one do you think belongs on the uncertain or gentle? I see. So we have, you might want to leave early. Yes. Yeah, I agree that that's probably on the more uncertain or gentle end. It's advisable to leave early is also more gentle than the second option. You must leave early. And this also shows these three different ways of telling someone to leave early to catch the train. You would tell someone how to catch the train in different ways depending on your relationship to them. So if you are a mother speaking to your child, you might say, must be the train. But if you're a friend, you might say something a little different. You might want to catch the train. Okay, thank you. Let's go back to the presentation. Oh, okay, yeah, thank you. All right, sorry about that sound. Great. So you can do more activities with this modality. Some other ideas are that students could act as advice columnists and write answers. So for the advice column, that the example I showed you a few minutes ago, you could have students pretend they are Dear Abby and write their own answers. You could also have students take on different roles. So for instance, a parent or a friend and give advice. And so you could ask students to say, well, how would you respond to this person if you were their parent or if you were their friend? And then once they do this, you can compare their writing with the actual response that is in the newspaper, the Dear Abby's response. And then you can discuss the language choices. Again, this activity may be for more advanced students, but this is something that you can work up towards. And you can do the same, and you can even do the same idea if you talk about smaller pieces of language and just begin to speak with students about how they would use different modality words depending on who they are talking to. Okay. So to summarize, we talked about a lot of information, and some of it was pretty complex. we said that grammar or language does three big tasks or three big jobs. So first, we said that grammar makes meaning, so expresses ideas. That's what we do with language. And then we said we can really look and analyze this by using this close reading analysis. So this close reading is similar to parts of speech, but looking at it in bigger chunks. So looking at the participants, the processes, and the circumstances. This is this close reading analysis. The second task we talked about was connect ideas. So this is the second task or the second function of language. And we said one activity that you can do to help students connect ideas or focus on this function is sentence combining, and have students look at cohesive devices or connectors and put together sentences in different ways. And thirdly, we talked about creating relationships. So relationships between the reader and the writer, or the listener and the speaker. And here we talked about modality as one tool that we have in grammar to create relationships. And an activity you can do with modality is the modality scale, looking at different examples from, for instance, advice columns, which is an example of authentic material. Or any other kinds of language, you can group the modality words on a modality scale. So lastly, just some tips to remember. These are things I've mentioned throughout the last little bit, but just to remind you. So first, whenever we teach grammar from a functional perspective using text, it's important to select reading examples that are about topics that are familiar to students, or that students have some background knowledge. At the beginning of the webinar, many of you said that students think grammar is boring. So we want to choose texts and books that is interesting and engaging for students. And if students don't have background on the topic, we want to build that background using pictures or images or discussion and video. And only after we build all of that, then we can start analyzing these sentences and looking carefully at the grammar. Next, it's always important to connect the grammar forms or the grammar structures to meaning. So a lot of times we can spend a lot of time really focusing on how to make the forms and practice how to form certain structures. Well, when we do this, it's important to focus on the meaning and say, well, why are we making these forms? How is this grammar contributing or making meaning in the text? Third, it's good to focus on discussion. And remember, often there are more than one right answer. There is more than one right answer. And part of the goal of this functional approach is to have students think about language and talk about language. And again, this promotes some of this critical thinking and also gives students an opportunity to use language and practice speaking. And lastly, it's always important to start with noticing new grammar forms in text and then gradually begin using them in writing. And this takes time. It doesn't take just one day to teach grammar, as you all know. So to gradually begin noticing different grammar structures in text as students read, and then have students use them in their writing. And you can use supports like the changing sentences or the filling in the blank at the beginning to help students use this grammar in their writing. So I hope that you can try out some of these activities in your classroom. Please visit the Ning and describe how it works for you. I'd love to hear from you and talk more. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren and Heather, for moderating.
And thank you, Lottie, for sharing that overview of using the functional approach to teaching grammar in the English language classroom. along with explaining those practical ideas for connecting reading and writing to grammar teaching. And we'd also like to say a big thank you to you, our audience, for your active participation today. We'd also love to see you register for the eTeacher MOOC that we discussed in the introduction and join teachers like you who are teaching grammar communicatively. And we'll show more information on that shortly. And now it's time to submit your attendance. Remember that